In 1965, Will Durant published the 9th of 11 volumes on the story of civilization, The Age of Voltaire. The life of Voltaire as a connecting thread between different nations and generations, recognizing him as the most significant figure of the time between the death of Louis XIV and the storming of the Bastille. According to some writers, Voltaire summarizes a century, and to others he is the true king of the 1700s. Will Durant writes, "The main theme of Volume 9, The Age of Voltaire, is the conflict between religion and the combined forces of science and philosophy. This conflict, which I refer to as a living drama, resulted in the secret secularism of modern times. This volume aims to explore the origins and consequences of this shift in thinking. One of the key questions I address is how the educated classes in Europe lost faith in the theology that had underpinned Western civilizations. I also explore what the effects of this transformation will be on various aspects of society, its morals, and its politics." Each volume and chapter in this series can be listened to independently. You can sit back and watch the story unfold, or skip to the sections that resonate most with the events around you. The following is a comprehensive summary of the story of civilization, The Age of Voltaire, highlighting its finest moments. Chapter 1. France, the Regency, the young Voltaire. François-Marie Arouet, not yet known as Voltaire, was born in Paris in 1694. Voltaire, sickly as a child, was tutored by the Abbé de Châteauneuf, a man of worldly views who imparted skepticism and a relaxed attitude towards religion to his young pupil. At 10, Voltaire entered the Jesuit college of Louis le Grand, where he excelled in his studies, especially drama, but alarmed his teachers with his questioning of religious doctrines. Despite his later criticisms of the church, he maintained respect for the Jesuits, crediting them with shaping his intellect. After graduating, Voltaire pursued literature against his father's wishes. He spent time with a group of free thinkers and shocked his father with his late nights. His stint as a page to the French ambassador in The Hague ended in disgrace after a passionate love affair with Olympe de Noailles. After reconciling with his father and briefly studying law, he seems to have renounced passionate love, preferring the company of friends. This period of Voltaire's life coincided with the death of Louis XIV and the dawn of the Regency, the struggle for the Regency. With the 5-year-old Louis XV on the throne, a struggle for the Regency ensued. The contenders were the Duke of Maine, legitimized son of Louis XIV, and Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, the late king's nephew. The Duke of Maine had the backing of Louis XIV's will, but Philippe skillfully secured the support of the Parliament by promising to restore their right to challenge royal edicts. This maneuver secured him the Regency. Boom and crash. Philippe's regency began with the daunting task of addressing France's dire financial state. He inherited a massive debt and a depleted treasury. Widespread corruption limited the effectiveness of his policies. Amidst a financial crisis, the Scotsman John Law arrived with his innovative system of finance, centered around a national bank and a credit system based on paper money. Gradually, however, speculators began selling their shares, triggering a decline in share prices and a panic. Public trust in Law's system evaporated, leading to bank runs, inflation, and social unrest. By the end of 1720, Law's system had collapsed, leaving the French economy in disarray. The regent, himself implicated in the financial turmoil, dismissed Law and abolished the Banque Royale. The regent, Philippe d'Orléans, the regent, was a complex character. Despite his reputation for debauchery, he possessed considerable intellect and a genuine interest in the arts and sciences. He was tolerant in matters of religion and open to new ideas, allowing thinkers like Voltaire that would have been previously banned. He also showed genuine concern for the welfare of the people, implementing reforms and striving to keep France out of war. However, Philippe's personal life was marked by excessive drinking and numerous affairs. Ultimately, Philippe's lifestyle contributed to his premature death at the age of 49. Society under the Regency. The Regency was an era of moral laxity and a decline in religious belief, particularly amongst the upper classes. While the peasantry and middle classes remained relatively grounded, the nobility and elite indulged in unrestrained pleasure-seeking, with infidelity becoming commonplace. Voltaire and the Bastille. Voltaire's early years were marked by a series of scandals and clashes with authority, often stemming from his satirical wit and irreverent attitude towards the powerful. After several brushes with the law, including a brief exile, Voltaire was briefly imprisoned in the Bastille in 1717 for verses criticizing the regent and the late Louis XIV. Facing exile, Voltaire chose England as his destination, hoping to find greater intellectual freedom and a society more open to his ideas. Chapter 2, The People. England in the Age of Voltaire was a fascinating mix of characters, from humble workers to cunning financiers, and from rough-hewn commoners to polished aristocrats. Prelude to the Industrial Revolution. Several factors contributed to this impending transformation. The sustainers. At the heart of this nation were the sustainers, the farmers and peasants whose toil fed the nation and whose displacement from traditional farming practices fueled the growth of urban centers. The enclosure of common lands by landlords, driven by the desire for larger and more profitable farms, led to a decline in the number of freeholders. Yet this period also saw significant advances in agricultural technology, with the four-course crop rotation system increasing yields by 30%. Industry. Industry was transitioning from a largely domestic model to a factory system, driven by the increasing demand for better tools and the widening of markets. This shift was gradual, taking almost a century to fully materialize. Invention. The spirit of invention was stirring, though not yet at the breakneck pace it would later attain. Significant inventions like John Kay's flying shuttle, which revolutionized weaving, often faced resistance from workers fearing technological unemployment. However, the growing demand for manufactured goods from expanding colonies, combined, propelled the development of new technologies. Louis Paul's spinning machine, patented in 1738, mechanized textile production, capital and labor. The increasing cost and complexity of machines, coupled with the demand for mechanical power, led to the rise of factories and, consequently, the importance of capitalists. This shift led to a transformation in the workers' relationship with their work, as they became increasingly dependent on factory owners for employment and wages. The division of labor, while increasing productivity, often reduced the worker to a cog in the machine, performing repetitive tasks. The average daily wage for various professions varied little between 1700 and 1770, and the employers often perceived workers as lazy and undeserving of higher wages. Transport and trade. The growth of the English economy was intertwined with improvements in transport and trade. While England's extensive coastline and network of rivers provided natural advantages, the poor condition of roads posed a significant challenge. This was starkly highlighted in 1745 when Bonnie Prince Charlie's rebel forces advanced southward because the poor roads hindered the royal troops. The government subsequently embarked on building a system of turnpikes. Meanwhile, foreign commerce thrived as Britain's naval dominance secured control over trade routes. The East India Company, with its lucrative trade in goods from India, attracted investors from all ranks of society, including dukes, countesses, and even clergymen. Money. The financial landscape of England was undergoing a transformation, with bankers emerging as crucial players. They facilitated commerce and industry through deposits, loans, and letters of credit. The establishment of the London Stock Exchange in 1698 led to the rise of joint stock companies and a wave of speculation. This speculative frenzy, exemplified by the South Sea Bubble, showcased the public's eagerness for quick profits and the potential for financial manipulation. Will Durant writes, "Shares were bargained for in taverns, coffee houses, and milliners' shops. Each night men and women calculated how rich they had become, and how much richer they might be if they had bought sooner or more." Public money was so eager for speculation that stock was sold in companies formed to extract crude oil from radishes, to create perpetual motion, and to import jackasses from Spain. One stock promoter announced a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is until later. He received 1,000 subscriptions of £2 each by midday and disappeared in the afternoon. Aspects of London. London, the bustling heart of England, was a microcosm of the nation's evolving character. It was a city of contrasts, where immense wealth and abject poverty coexisted. By 1740, London had become the world's most populous city, an estimated 725,000 inhabitants. Its strategic location on the Thames made it a hub for both domestic and international trade. Some areas, like the riverside, teemed with vice and poverty, alive with lusty longshoremen, sex-starved sailors, and women loose in dress and code. London also housed the centers of political power, cultural life, and burgeoning businesses. The city was undergoing improvements with the introduction of street numbers in 1708, the installation of oil lamps for nighttime illumination, and efforts to enhance sanitation. Schools. Education in England was a mixed bag. While a few institutions like charity schools provided free education, the majority of the population, especially the poor, remained illiterate. Apprenticeship was considered a valuable form of education for the artisan class. Public schools, catering to the elite and emphasizing classical education, were largely inaccessible to dissenters, who established their own academies. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge, though prestigious, suffered from a conservative curriculum and were criticized by figures like Adam Smith and Edward Gibbon for their lack of intellectual vitality. Morals. The moral landscape of England was marked by both piety and promiscuity. Prostitution was rampant, especially in London, where an estimated 50,000 women engaged in the trade. The law, though harsh in its condemnation of prostitution, was often circumvented through bribes or simply ignored. Marriage, often arranged for financial or social reasons, was frequently treated as a matter of convenience rather than a sacred bond. Crime and punishment. England's legal system, while offering some protections for individual rights, was also characterized by harsh punishments and a growing number of capital offenses. The penal code, though considered an improvement over the past, remained brutal, with public hanging serving as both a deterrent and a form of entertainment. The glorification of notorious criminals like Jack Sheppard and Dick Turpin further underscored the public's ambivalent attitude toward law and order. Will Durant writes, Jack, after almost daily robberies in or near London, was betrayed to the police by Jonathan Wild. He escaped, was rearrested, escaped again, was caught in his cups, and was hanged, aged 22, before a crowd of thousands that expected him to escape even with the noose around his neck. Prisons were overcrowded, unsanitary, and breeding grounds for disease, with debtors often facing the grim prospect of indefinite confinement. The deportation of convicts to the American colonies, where they endured harsh conditions and high mortality rates, was a common practice. Chesterfield. The figure of Philip Dormer Stanhope, 4th Earl of Chesterfield, offers a fascinating glimpse into the mind of an 18th century English aristocrat. His letters to his son, though often criticized for their worldly advice, provide a window into the values and aspirations of his class. From the time that you have had life, he told the youth, it has been the principal and favorite object of mine to make you as perfect as the imperfections of human nature will allow. Chesterfield, a seasoned diplomat and politician, emphasized the importance of social graces, political acumen, and a pragmatic approach to life. His counsel on seduction, though shocking to modern sensibilities, reflected the prevailing attitudes of the time. He believed that women, while lacking in intellectual depth, held considerable influence in society and could be valuable allies in a man's pursuit of power. Will Durant writes, in matters of sex, Chesterfield's advice to his son amused the French and horrified the English. He thought a few liaisons were an excellent preparation for marriage and maturity. He merely insisted that Philip's mistresses should be women of good manners, so that they might refine him while sinning. He recommended Madame Dupin because of her good breeding and delicacy. He instructed his son in the strategy of seduction. No refusal should be supinely accepted, for the most virtuous woman, far from being offended at a declaration of love, is flattered by it if it is made in a polite and agreeable manner. If she listens and allows you to repeat your declaration, be persuaded that if you do not dare all the rest, she will laugh at you. If you are not listened to the first time, try a second, a third, and a fourth. If the place is not already taken, depend upon it, it may be conquered. Chesterfield's own life, marked by political successes and failures, marital disappointment, and a deep affection for his son, embodied the complexities of the age. His enduring legacy, however, rests on his letters. which, despite their flaws, offer a valuable insight into the social and political landscape of 18th century England. Chapter 3. The Rulers. A narrative of England's rulers. The English, having removed 2 monarchs in quick succession, found themselves with a new king, George I of Hanover. George I, imported to prevent a Stuart restoration, had left his heart and mind in Germany and cared little for England or the English language. He saw the English Parliament as a necessary evil, something to be manipulated and controlled. His reign was one of political maneuvering and a bitter feud with his son, George Augustus, Prince of Wales. The political landscape of England was divided between the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories, favoring the landed nobility and the divine right of kings, found themselves out of favor with the ascension of George I. The Whigs, representing the gentry and commercial interests, took advantage of the king's indifference to English affairs and cemented their power, establishing a system of party government through a cabinet. With George I's inability to understand English, the dominant member of the cabinet became the prime minister, taking on more and more of the king's powers. The threat of a Stuart restoration was a constant worry for George I and the Whig establishment. Upon the death of George I in 1727, his son, George II, ascended the throne, inheriting a kingdom still divided by religious and political factions. George II, much like his father, was a man of military bearing, more comfortable on the battlefield than in the halls of Parliament. He relied heavily on the counsel of his wife, Queen Caroline, a woman of sharp intellect and a keen political mind. While England navigated its political complexities, Ireland suffered under the heavy hand of English rule. The predominantly Catholic Irish population faced systematic oppression, their land confiscated and their economic opportunities stifled by English laws. The Irish Parliament, composed entirely of Protestants, was subservient to England, and the penal code severely restricted the rights of Catholics. Jonathan Swift, the Anglican Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, emerged as a powerful voice for the Irish people. His Drapier's Letters, published in 1724, attacked the introduction of a new copper coinage, which he saw as an attempt by England to exploit Ireland. Swift's writings rallied the Irish people and forced the English government to back down. He continued to denounce English misrule, famously declaring that all government without the consent of the governed is the very definition of slavery. In contrast to Ireland, Scotland, united with England by the 1707 Act of Union, fared better in the 18th century. The Union opened up opportunities for trade with English colonies, stimulating the Scottish economy. Scotland also boasted a robust education system, with parish schools in every community and 4 universities. Despite these advancements, Jacobite sentiment remained strong, fueled by a longing for the restoration of the Stuart dynasty. Chapter 4. Religion and Philosophy. The 18th century in England saw a decline in religious fervor and a rise in philosophical challenges to Christianity. As the Church of England became increasingly tied to the state and the ruling class, its spiritual authority waned. Deists like Tyndale and Middleton chipped away at the foundations of Christian belief, while philosophers like Hume subjected religion and morality to rigorous skeptical scrutiny. At the same time, John Wesley and the Methodist movement sparked a religious revival among the working classes, injecting a new emotional intensity into English religious life. The religious situation. The 18th century opened with a general decline in religious observance, particularly among the upper echelons of society. The Church of England, associated with the fallen Stuart dynasty, lost face and influence, becoming subservient to the state and the ruling elite. Church services themselves reflected the rigid class divisions of English society, with assigned seating based on social standing, the historian observed. In some London churches, when too many of the poor came to worship, the periwigged members fled, locking their pews behind them and seeking fresher air. Many bishops and clergymen were more concerned with worldly advancement and comfortable living than with spiritual matters. The church had become a haven for opportunists and sycophants, further eroding its moral authority. The author paints a rather unflattering picture of the church hierarchy. The Bishop of London was said to have secured his elevation to a clergyman for £5,000. I see crowds of cassocks rustling up the back stairs of the ladies of the court. stealthy clergy slipping purses into their laps, and that godless old king yawning under his canopy in his chapel royal. This created fertile ground for the rise of deism and other challenges to traditional Christianity. The deistic challenge. The deists, building upon the work of earlier thinkers, sought to strip Christianity of its supernatural elements and reduce it to a belief in God and immortality. They challenged the validity of biblical revelation, arguing that the true revelation lay in nature and the God-given faculty of reason. Matthew Tyndall, in his influential work Christianity as Old as the Creation, questioned the logic of a revelation confined to one small people for thousands of years and only belatedly extended to a portion of humanity. Tyndall argued, why should God have given his revelation to one small people, the Jews, had let it remain their exclusive possession for 4,000 years, and then had sent his Son to them with another revelation that after 1,700 years was still confined to a minority of the human race? Deistic writers like Tyndall and Conyers Middleton pointed to the inconsistencies and contradictions in the Bible, the prevalence of evil and suffering in the world, and the Church's history of persecution and intolerance as evidence against the truth of Christian claims. They contrasted this with the seemingly more rational and humane philosophies of figures like Confucius and Cicero. The religious rebuttal. Christian apologists rose to the challenge, defending the tenets of their faith with learning and vigor. Bishop Sherlock, for example, argued that rejecting well-attested events simply because they run counter to our experience is a risky proposition, as history is replete with examples of phenomena once deemed impossible that later became commonplace. The philosopher George Berkeley, in his Alciphron, warned that deism, if taken to its logical conclusion, would lead to atheism and the collapse of morality. He maintained that many scientific concepts are just as incomprehensible as the doctrine of the Trinity, implying that the deists should be as skeptical of science as they were of religion. Joseph Butler, perhaps the most thoughtful and influential of the Christian apologists, addressed the problem of evil and suffering in his analogy of religion. He argued that the apparent injustices and cruelties in the Bible are no more perplexing than the many examples of suffering found in the natural world. Both nature and revelation, he argued, point to the existence of a God who operates according to principles that may transcend our limited human understanding. John Wesley. While theologians and philosophers debated the merits of Christianity, John Wesley, along with his brother Charles and the fiery preacher George Whitefield, sparked a religious revival that swept through the working classes of England. The Methodist preachers, often unschooled in the finer points of theology, addressed the emotions of their largely unlettered audiences, offering a message of sin, repentance, and the promise of salvation through faith in Christ. Wesley's message resonated with the anxieties and hopes of the poor, providing them with a sense of meaning and purpose in a world often marked by hardship and suffering. Wesley himself was a tireless evangelist, traveling thousands of miles each year to preach in fields, marketplaces, and even prisons. The historian describes one such event. When Wesley appeared at Wednesbury, it cried out for his blood and applauded those who beat him. He prayed aloud and it let him go. Methodism's emphasis on emotional experience and its reliance on lay preachers who spoke the language of the common people revitalized religious belief in England. But it also represented a retreat from the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. David Hume. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher and historian, stands as one of the most significant and controversial figures of the 18th century. Deeply influenced by the empiricism of John Locke, Hume developed a skeptical philosophy that challenged the very foundations of knowledge, morality, and religion. In his treatise of human nature and later in his more accessible inquiries, Hume argued that all knowledge derives ultimately from experience and that reason alone cannot prove the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, or even the objective reality of cause and effect. He argued that belief in miracles is irrational, as it requires us to accept testimony that something highly improbable has occurred, when it is far more likely that the witnesses are either mistaken or deliberately deceiving us. In one of his most widely quoted passages, Hume writes, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish." The young philosopher. Born into a Presbyterian family in Edinburgh, Hume's early life was steeped in Calvinist theology. He attended the University of Edinburgh, but left without a degree, determined to pursue a life of literature and philosophy. As he immersed himself in the works of Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, his religious faith gradually dissolved. Reason deflated. Hume's philosophy is characterized by a profound skepticism towards the powers of human reason. He argued that our beliefs are not based on rational deduction but on custom and habit. We believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, not because we have logically deduced this from first principles, but because it has risen every day in our experience. Hume extended this skepticism to the realm of morality, arguing that our moral judgments are based not on reason but on sentiment and fellow feeling. Morals and miracles. Hume's skeptical analysis of religion, particularly his essay of Miracles, sparked heated debate and contributed to the growing secularization of European thought. He argued that the alleged miracles of the Bible cannot withstand critical scrutiny and that belief in them is ultimately a product of ignorance and superstition. In his dialogues concerning natural religion, Hume presented a devastating critique of the argument from design, suggesting that the imperfections and suffering in the world point either to a limited or indifferent deity, or perhaps to no deity at all. Darwinism and Christianity. Hume, in his dialogues concerning natural religion, anticipated Darwin's theory of natural selection by arguing that the apparent design in the universe could be the result of a long process of trial and error, with nature gradually selecting those variations that proved most successful. Hume's insights in this area paved the way for later thinkers who would challenge the traditional view of a divinely created and ordered world. Communism and democracy. Hume's skepticism extended to political utopias. He believed that human nature, with its inherent self-interest and tendency towards inequality, made egalitarian societies impossible to achieve or sustain. He rejected both communism and democracy as impractical and potentially harmful systems of government. Hume favored a mixed constitution that balanced the interests of monarchy, aristocracy, and the people, much like the system that had evolved in England. History. Hume, in his later years, turned his attention to history, producing a monumental 6-volume history of England. Like his philosophical works, Hume's history is marked by a skeptical approach and a determination to explain events in terms of human passions and motivations rather than divine providence. He saw history as a laboratory for studying human nature, offering insights into the enduring patterns of human behavior that transcend time and place. Hume wrote, "Mankind are so much the same in all times and places that history informs us of nothing new or strange in this particular." The old philosopher. Despite the controversy surrounding his religious and philosophical views, Hume was widely admired for his wit, his learning, and his amiable personality. He enjoyed the company of women and maintained a wide circle of friends, including the economist Adam Smith. He died in Edinburgh in 1776, facing death with his characteristic equanimity and good humor. Hume, in his final days, remarked on his life and imminent death, "I have been endeavoring to open the eyes of the public. If I live a few years longer, I may have the satisfaction of seeing the downfall of some of the prevailing systems of superstition." Hume's legacy as a philosopher and historian is immense. His skeptical critique of religion, his naturalistic account of morality, and his insights into the workings of human nature continue to shape philosophical debate today. His history of England, though now superseded by more recent scholarship, remains a landmark achievement, admired for its style and its attempt to understand the past in purely human terms. Chapter 5. Literature and the Stage. England in the 18th century was experiencing a literary and theatrical boom. Not only was there population growth but also a rise in literacy. The middle class increasingly became the patrons of literature, replacing the aristocracy. The popularity of newspapers to meet the public's appetite for news, fueled by political and international affairs, gave them considerable influence. By 1738, the power of the press was considered greater than that of Parliament. Booksellers often drove hard bargains with authors, who typically sold their copyrights for a lump sum and only received additional payments if the book proved exceptionally successful. Many authors lived in poverty, despite the expansion of the literary market. The social status of authors declined due to their poverty and the severing of ties with aristocratic patronage. the birth of the modern novel. While stories and long narratives had existed previously, it was the works of Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding that truly established the novel as we know it today. They introduced complex plots, character development, and social commentary, elevating the novel beyond mere entertainment. Chapter 6: Art and Music. When it came to music and art, England remained in the shadows of continental Europe. The English talent seemed to gravitate towards commerce and war, leaving less room for the cultivation of the arts, the artists. While there were minor achievements in porcelain and decorative arts, English art truly struggled to find its footing. Sculpture was just emerging as a distinct profession. Painting largely revolved around portraiture. Native talent struggled to find patronage, as the elite preferred foreign artists, the musicians. English music seemed confined to songs and ballads, lacking the grandeur and complexity of continental composers. Thomas Arne set Shakespeare's songs to music, creating enduring like "Blow, Blow, Thou Winter Wind" and "Where the Bee Sucks, There Suck I." It was also during this period that the national anthem of Britain, "God Save the King," emerged, originally sung in 1745 to rally support for George II during the Jacobite uprising. Voltaire in England. Voltaire, the French writer and philosopher, spent 3 formative years in England, immersing himself in its literary, intellectual, and political life. He was impressed by the relative freedom of speech and thought he observed in England, contrasting it with the restrictions he faced in France. He marveled at the English respect for commerce and practicality, admiring their straightforward manners and lack of ostentation. Voltaire's experience in England shaped his thinking and provided him with ammunition for his lifelong battle against intolerance and superstition. Chapter 7: The People and the State. The France that Voltaire returned to in 1728 was divided into 3 estates or classes: the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate. The latter was comprised of everyone else, including the peasantry, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie. Each of these played a role in the events that were to unfold. The nobility, who made up about 400,000 souls, were largely defined by their ownership of land. They were further subdivided into ranks based on their titles, leading to petty squabbles over ceremonial privileges. A distinction also existed between the old nobility, whose lineage stretched back generations, and those recently ennobled. By 1789, many nobles were middle class in origin, having achieved their status through legal or administrative roles, forming the noblesse de robe. The exemption of the nobles from most taxes opened them to accusations of being parasites. The clergy. The Catholic Church was a powerful force in France, wielding immense wealth and influence. Estimates suggest the clergy numbered around 194,000 by 1762. The higher clergy, often appointed from noble families, lived in considerable luxury. The church held vast estates, sometimes encompassing entire towns, and benefited from tithes and feudal dues collected from the peasantry. This immense wealth, exempt from taxation, sparked resentment among the populace. While attempts were made to tax the church, they were ultimately unsuccessful due to the clergy's resistance and the king's reliance on their support. Despite the worldliness of the hierarchy, the church played a crucial role in the lives of ordinary people. Parish priests often shared the poverty of their parishioners and provided essential services like education and charity. The third estate, the peasantry. The French peasantry faced a life of grinding poverty. While land ownership was increasing, the small size of their holdings meant many relied on additional work as hired hands. A variety of feudal dues and obligations remained in place, including forced labor on the lord's land and fees for using his facilities. Literal serfdom, binding peasants to the soil, persisted in some areas. Heavy taxation further burdened the peasantry, leaving them with little incentive for improvement. Drunkenness and religion offered solace from the harsh realities of life. The proletariat. The urban proletariat consisted of artisans, craftsmen, and laborers. Much of industry was still domestic or organized in guilds, which, while offering some protection, stifled competition and hindered progress. The growth of factories and rural manufacturing, however, led to increasing numbers of wage earners dependent on entrepreneurs. This shift, along with the invention of machinery, was met with resistance from workers who feared for their livelihoods. The bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, doctors, professors, administrators, manufacturers, merchants, and financiers, were steadily growing in wealth and influence. Frustrated by government regulations and tolls, they advocated for economic freedom. This wealthy upper bourgeoisie also played a key role in patronizing the arts and supporting the burgeoning Enlightenment movement. The government. While the king held absolute power, the middle class filled many administrative roles, prefiguring the bourgeois state that would emerge in the following century. Yet, the centralized and bureaucratic nature of the French administration hindered local initiative and fueled resentment. The arbitrary use of lettres de cachet, which allowed for imprisonment without trial, further eroded trust in the government. The legal system was equally flawed, with a contradictory patchwork of laws and courts. Criminal justice was harsh, with torture used to extract confessions. The powerful Parlement, acting as supreme courts, claimed the right to block royal edicts, setting the stage for future conflicts with the monarchy. Meanwhile, the court at Versailles remained a hotbed of intrigue, extravagance, and adultery. The young Louis XV was ill-prepared for rule and largely indifferent to the burdens of government. The 7 Years' War loomed on the horizon. Visionaries like René Louis de Villers d'Argenson foresaw the need for radical reform. His prediction of a coming revolution proved prophetic. Madame de Pompadour. Perhaps the most intriguing figure of this era was Madame de Pompadour. Rising from middle-class origins, she captivated Louis XV and became his mistress, wielding considerable power at court. The court, resenting her middle-class origins, called her Madame Whore. Her household expenses cost the treasury 33,000 livres per year. France condemned her as costing more than a war. Chapter 8. Morals and Manners. France was a society where refinement and extravagance masked a deep moral malaise, where wit and elegance coexisted with cruelty and indifference. Education, the battle for young minds. The struggle for control of education was a key battleground in 18th century France. The Church, clinging to its traditional authority, fought to maintain its grip on the education system. On the other side, the Philosophes and other reformers championed secular education, arguing that knowledge should be free from religious dogma and accessible to all. Education for the masses. For the vast majority of the French population, particularly the peasantry, education was a luxury they could ill afford. Education for the elite. In contrast, the middle and upper classes enjoyed a more privileged education, often through private tutors and governesses. Girls were typically confined to convents where their education focused on religion, domestic skills, and social graces. The Jesuit influence. Jesuit colleges provided a rigorous classical curriculum that emphasized logic, rhetoric, and character formation. Despite their religious orientation, the Jesuits' emphasis on critical thinking ironically nurtured the very spirit of inquiry that would later challenge their own authority. Emerging criticisms. By mid-century, criticisms of the existing education system were mounting. Critics argued that the curriculum was outdated, overly theoretical, and neglecting practical skills. Morals, a spectrum of virtue and vice. 18th century French society presented a kaleidoscope of moral behaviors, ranging from acts of extraordinary charity and selflessness to shocking instances of cruelty and depravity. Contrasting moralities. The peasantry, clinging to their religious faith, generally maintained a relatively strict moral code, reinforced by the close-knit structure of family and community life. The middle classes also adhered to traditional values, with the bourgeois wife often depicted as a model of piety and domestic virtue. In stark contrast, the court aristocracy indulged in a culture of extravagance and libertinism, seemingly unburdened by moral constraints. Corruption and dishonesty flourished, with offices sold for personal gain and tax revenues often diverted into private pockets. Dueling, despite repeated attempts to ban it, remained a common way to settle disputes. Homosexuality and prostitution, though technically illegal, were treated with varying degrees of tolerance depending on social class. While love marriages were becoming more common, particularly in literature, most marriages were still arranged by parents, primarily as economic and social alliances rather than unions of hearts. Adultery was rampant among the aristocracy, often viewed as an acceptable substitute for divorce, which was prohibited by the Catholic Church. The neglect of children, particularly in the upper classes, was a disturbing feature of this society, with many infants handed over to wet nurses and raised by servants. Paradoxically, this morally ambiguous society cultivated a remarkable level of refinement and elegance. The French prided themselves on their mastery of social graces in the pursuit of pleasure. Chapter 10. The Play of the Mind. French, thanks to Louis XIV's political clout and the brilliance of its writers, became the lingua franca of Europe, replacing Latin in international diplomacy and intellectual circles. The French Academy, through its dictionary, polished and standardized the language, making French prose a model of precision and clarity. This linguistic dominance provided a fertile ground for authors who found a growing audience in the expanding middle class. Even private correspondence transformed into an art form, with letters becoming vehicles for witty exchanges and insightful discourse on matters of public concern. The allure of the stage. Theaters, alongside salons, became centers of Parisian life. The theater, Voltaire proclaimed, is the most enchanting of all careers. Success on stage promised both fame and fortune, attracting a multitude of playwrights and actors. Chapter 11. Voltaire in France. Fresh from his intellectual awakening in England, Voltaire returned to France, not as a subdued exile but as a man brimming with energy and ideas, ready to challenge the very foundations of French society. His years in England had shaped his thinking, fueling his admiration for English liberty and his disdain for French absolutism and religious intolerance. Parisian Gambits, 1729-34. Voltaire secured the annulment of his exile, even regaining his royal pension, demonstrating his knack for navigating court politics. Voltaire's Letters on the English became a lightning rod for controversy, sparking condemnation from church and state. These seemingly innocuous letters, addressed to his friend Theriot, were in reality a thinly veiled critique of French society, contrasting the liberties enjoyed in England with the constraints imposed in France. Voltaire extolled the virtues of the Quakers, their simple piety and pacifism standing in contrast to the opulent and often hypocritical French clergy. He celebrated England's religious tolerance, where an Englishman, like a free man, goes to heaven by whatever route he chooses. He contrasted the English system of government, with its checks and balances and its principle of no taxation without representation, with the French system of absolute monarchy, where the king's power was unchecked and the burden of taxation fell disproportionately on the commoners. He praised the English for their respect for commerce and industry, unlike the French, who often looked down upon merchants. Voltaire concluded his letters with a defense of natural rights, arguing that the English Constitution has, in fact, arrived at the point of excellence, in consequence of which all men are restored to those natural rights which in nearly all monarchies they are deprived of. These rights included liberty of person and property, freedom of the press, trial by jury, and freedom of religion. While Voltaire's depiction of English society was idealized, his letters served as a powerful indictment of French absolutism and a rallying cry for reform. The book's condemnation by the authorities, the burning of copies by the public hangman, and the issuance of a warrant for Voltaire's arrest forced him to flee France, seeking refuge in the arms of his new mistress, the Marquise du Châtelet. The controversy surrounding the letters, however, only served to amplify its impact, solidifying Voltaire's reputation as a daring critic and a champion of Enlightenment ideals. The Courtier, 1745-48. Voltaire's return to Paris in 1745 marked a new chapter in his life. At 50, he was at the zenith of his fame, his plays celebrated, his writings widely read, his wit admired and feared in equal measure. The patronage of Madame de Pompadour, the king's mistress and a woman of considerable influence, opened doors for him, leading to his appointment as royal historiographer and his long-coveted admission to the French Academy. He basked in the glow of courtly favor, composing odes to commemorate French military victories and collaborating with Rameau on festival operas to celebrate royal occasions. His Temple de la Gloire, with its thinly veiled allusions to Louis XV, earned him a seat at the king's table, a testament to his newfound status. Yet, court life proved to be a double-edged sword. Voltaire, for all his wit and charm, was ill-suited to the delicate dance of courtly etiquette. His satirical poem celebrating the French victory at Bergen-op-Zoom, with its indelicate references to Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour, scandalized the court, jeopardizing his hard-won favor. He spoke of Louis as flying from the victory to the arms of his illegitimate mistress, and charged both of them to keep what they had conquered. The queen was outraged, so were her children. Voltaire had to flee once again. Chapter 12. The Germany of Bach. While Voltaire may have overlooked the significance of Germany during his travels, the nation was experiencing a period of cultural revival, the German scene. The Germany of this era was a patchwork of over 300 independent states, a far cry from the unified nation it would become. While this division hindered national unity, it did foster a diverse and dynamic cultural landscape. One unifying factor was the commercial activity, exemplified by the Leipzig Fair, the most frequented in all of Europe. It surpassed even the Frankfurt Fair, including in the sale of books. German life. Germany distinguished itself as a leader in education, with King Frederick William I of Prussia making primary education compulsory in 1717 and subsequently founding 1,700 schools. This emphasis on education extended to higher learning as well, with universities of Göttingen and Erlangen embracing academic freedom and expanding their curricula to include scientific and social studies. However, the German language itself faced a challenge, with the aristocracy increasingly favoring French as a mark of sophistication. Voltaire observed, "I find myself here in France. No one talks anything but French. German is for the soldiers and the horses, it is needed only on the road." German music. From the birth of Handel and Bach in 1685 to the death of Brahms in 1897, German music reigned supreme. Music was an integral part of German life. The Bach family, a veritable musical dynasty, produced a long line of talented musicians, setting the stage for the emergence of their most celebrated member, Johann Sebastian Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750. Chronology. Born in Eisenach, the town where Luther had spent his formative years, Bach's musical journey began early, learning violin from his father and clavier from his brother. His talent as an organist quickly became apparent, leading him to appointments in Arnstadt, Mühlhausen, and Weimar, where he composed some of his most enduring organ works. In 1723, Bach accepted the position of cantor at the Thomasschule in Leipzig, a post he would hold until his death. Bach poured his energy into composing and performing music for the city's churches. His later years were marked by declining eyesight, culminating in blindness following an unsuccessful operation. Bach died in Leipzig in 1750. Compositions: instrumental. The organ was Bach's primary instrument and the medium through which he expressed his profound musicality. Bach's compositions for the clavichord and harpsichord demanded the full use of all fingers and introducing a curved hand position. Coda. Johann Sebastian Bach's life was devoted to music. His compositions, deeply rooted in the Lutheran tradition, reflect a profound spiritual depth and a mastery of musical craft. Bach remained largely forgotten after his death until the 19th century, when his music was rediscovered. Chapter 13. Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa. Imperial Prelude, 1711–40. The story begins not with Frederick, but with Maria Theresa, the young queen thrust onto the throne of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her inheritance was one of grandeur and burden, encompassing a diverse array of territories and peoples, from the stately palaces of Vienna to the turbulent plains of Hungary. Yet this empire was beset with challenges. Bohemia, once a proud kingdom, was now in decline, plagued by religious intolerance and economic exploitation. Hungary, scarred by centuries of conflict, harbored a fiercely independent nobility resistant to Austrian rule. The Austrian aristocracy, intertwined with the Catholic Church, held sway over a predominantly feudal society where serfdom persisted. The court at Vienna, with 40,000 souls, was a microcosm of this aristocratic dominance. Marriages were matters of protocol, and even love affairs were confined within the rigid boundaries of class. As Lady Mary Montagu observed, 'Tis the established custom for every lady to have two husbands, one that bears the name and another that performs the duties. While Austria excelled in architecture, sculpture, and music, its military prowess was waning. Charles VI, Maria Theresa's father, was a man of good intentions but limited abilities. His reign witnessed a series of military setbacks, culminating in the loss of territories to the Turks. His greatest concern was securing the succession of his daughter to the throne. The Pragmatic Sanction, painstakingly negotiated and guaranteed by the European powers, aimed to ensure Maria Theresa's inheritance. However, the stage was set for a power struggle as rivals emerged, eager to exploit any weakness in the young queen's position. Prussian Prelude, 1713-40. A new power was rising in the north, Prussia. Frederick William I, the great drill sergeant of the Prussian nation, transformed his realm into a military powerhouse, forging a disciplined and formidable Frederick William I. Frederick William I was an austere and demanding ruler, driven by a relentless pursuit of efficiency and order. He streamlined the administration, enforced strict moral standards, and promoted industry and thrift. Through conscription and recruitment, he amassed a force of 80,000 men in a nation of only 3 million. He drilled his troops relentlessly, instilling in them a level of discipline and precision that would prove decisive in future conflicts. Der Junge Fritz. While Frederick William I was obsessed with military might, his son Frederick showed little inclination for martial pursuits. The young prince preferred the refinement of French culture, indulging in poetry, music, and philosophy. This clash of personalities created a bitter conflict between father and son. Frederick William I, frustrated by his son's apparent intellectual leanings, resorted to harsh punishments and violence. Frederick, finding solace in the company of like-minded friends, plotted to escape to England. The plan was discovered, leading to the arrest and imprisonment of Frederick and his companions. His friend, Cotta, was executed, and Frederick was forced to witness the gruesome spectacle. Following his release, Frederick entered into a period of enforced apprenticeship, studying the administration of the Prussian provinces and learning the intricacies of governance. While he continued to pursue his intellectual interests, he also began to understand the realities of power and the demands of leadership. The Prince and the Philosopher, 1736-40. During his time at Rheinsberg, Frederick engaged in a lively correspondence with Voltaire, the leading light of the French Enlightenment. This exchange of letters reveals the evolution of Frederick's thinking as he grappled with the challenges of leadership and the complexities of human nature. Frederick, initially drawn to Voltaire's wit and literary brilliance, embraced the philosopher's ideals of tolerance and reason. However, as he assumed the responsibilities of rule, his views became more pragmatic, recognizing the inherent selfishness of human nature and the need for a strong state to maintain order. In his Refutation du Prince de Machiavel, Frederick argued against the Italian philosopher's justification of any means necessary to achieve political ends. He advocated for a ruler guided by principles of justice, honor, and service to the people. Yet, as we shall see, Frederick's actions as king would often contradict these lofty pronouncements. The new Machiavelli. Upon the death of his father in 1740, Frederick ascended to the Prussian throne. His initial actions seemed to confirm his commitment to enlightened principles. He abolished torture, promoted religious tolerance, and supported the arts and sciences. However, the death of Charles VI and the accession of Maria Theresa to the Austrian throne presented Frederick with an irresistible opportunity. Recognizing the vulnerability of the young queen and the weakness of the Austrian army, Frederick swiftly abandoned his pacifist ideals and set his sights on Silesia. He justified his aggression by invoking Prussia's historical claims to the territory and the need to strengthen his realm's strategic position. His actions revealed the tension between his philosophical aspirations and the realpolitik of international relations. He was, as Voltaire would later dub him, the new Machiavelli. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-48. Frederick's invasion of Silesia, modern-day Poland, triggered a chain reaction, drawing in the major European powers into a conflict that would engulf the continent for 8 years. France, eager to weaken Austria and prevent a rapprochement between its traditional enemies, joined forces with Bavaria, Prussia, and Spain. Belle-Isle, the French architect of this alliance, envisioned the dismemberment of the Austrian Empire, with each participant receiving a share of the spoils. Maria Theresa, facing overwhelming odds, rallied the Hungarian nobility to her cause, appealing to their sense of chivalry and offering political concessions in return for their military support. Her efforts paid off, as Hungarian troops allowed her to take the offensive, even capturing the Bavarian capital of Munich. Frederick, ever the opportunist, played a double game throughout the conflict. He signed treaties and then broke them, exploiting every shift in the balance of power to advance his own interests. He made a secret truce with Austria and then rejoined his allies, motivated by a desire to prevent France from becoming too dominant in Central Europe. The war raged on, with battles fought in Silesia, Bohemia, Flanders, and Italy. Maria Theresa, despite her initial setbacks, gradually gained the upper hand. The death of Charles VII and the withdrawal of Bavaria from the conflict weakened the French alliance, allowing Austria to focus its forces against Prussia. England, weary of the financial burden of war and concerned about French advances in the Netherlands, pressured Maria Theresa to make peace with Frederick. The Queen, reluctant to relinquish her claim to Silesia, resisted these overtures. However, the separate peace between England and Prussia, recognizing Frederick's possession of the disputed territory, forced her hand. In the Treaty of Dresden, Maria Theresa finally ceded Silesia to Prussia, bringing an end to the Second Silesian War. Frederick's gamble had paid off. He had defied the European powers and emerged from the conflict as the master of a significantly expanded realm. Frederick at home, 1745-50. After a decade of war and intrigue, Frederick returned to Berlin, determined to consolidate his gains and secure Prussia's position as a major European power. He embraced the Machiavellian principle that the interest of the state must serve as the rule for sovereigns, justifying his actions by the need to safeguard Prussia's survival in a hostile world. Despite his philosophical leanings, Frederick remained an absolute monarch, brooking no dissent in ruling with an iron hand. A strict and centrally controlled economy fostered industry and commerce and continued to expand and refine the Prussian army. His cynical view of human nature led him to rely on a strong police force to maintain order and suppress any challenge to his authority. While he protected religious freedom in his realm, he saw religion primarily as a tool for social control. He had little personal faith, famously remarking, "I find order and the laws sufficient." His personal life was marked by austerity and emotional detachment. He had a strained relationship with his wife, preferring the company of his dogs and a select circle of male friends. Voltaire in Germany, 1750-54. In 1750, Voltaire, lured by Frederick's promises of patronage and intellectual companionship, arrived in Berlin. He was initially enchanted by his reception, enjoying the king's lavish hospitality and engaging in lively philosophical discussions at the royal supper table. However, the relationship between the two men quickly soured. Voltaire, unable to resist the temptation to enrich himself, became embroiled in a shady financial scheme involving Saxon bonds. This scandal, along with his ongoing feud with Maupertuis, the head of the Berlin Academy, strained his relationship with Frederick. Voltaire's diatribe of Dr. Akakia, a satirical attack on authority, infuriated the king. Frederick, sensitive to any criticism of his academy, ordered the public burning of the pamphlet. The relationship between the philosopher and the king, once a beacon of Enlightenment ideals, ended in acrimony and betrayal. Voltaire, fearing for his safety, fled Germany. His subsequent detention in Frankfurt at the behest of Frederick further soured their relationship. The episode marked the end of Voltaire's dream of finding a haven for intellectual freedom under the patronage of an enlightened monarch. He would spend the rest of his life searching for a place where he could write and think freely. Chapter 14, Switzerland and Voltaire. Les Délices. In 1755, at the age of 60, Voltaire finally found a place where he could live in peace and security. He purchased a spacious villa called Street Jean, with terraced gardens descending to the Rhone, just outside the gates of Geneva. Due to Genevan law, the 87,000 francs required to buy the property was provided through agents. Overjoyed by his new home, Voltaire renamed it Les Délices or Delights. At Les Délices, Voltaire indulged in lordly luxuries, keeping 6 horses, 4 carriages, several servants, and a monkey. His niece, Madame Denis, reigned over this establishment. Contemporary accounts describe Madame Denis as an ugly and good woman with limited intellect who adored Voltaire. Les Délices had one drawback: it was cold in winter. To escape the cold, Voltaire bought a small hermitage, Menrien, near Lausanne. He later purchased a larger house in Lausanne, where he staged plays, mainly his own. Voltaire moved between Geneva and Lausanne, becoming familiar with Switzerland, the cantons. Switzerland in the 18th century was a mix of 3 peoples, 4 languages, and 2 faiths. The country had remained peaceful since 1515. The Swiss people were known for producing excellent soldiers, many of whom served in foreign armies. The Swiss Confederation in 1715 consisted of 13 cantons, each with its own government. The cantons were predominantly German-speaking, with some French-speaking areas, and were divided between Protestant and Catholic faiths. Switzerland was republican but not democratic. In each canton, a small group of elite families held power, electing councils that governed the state. The Swiss historian Nikolai Karamzin noted that the citizens of Zurich were as proud of their title as a king of his crown. Cantonal governments were generally authoritarian, regulating many aspects of life, including clothing and wages. Zurich, for example, functioned as a corporative state, with the masters of the 12 guilds automatically becoming members of the small council. Serfdom was largely absent, and many peasants owned their land. Agriculture and industry often coexisted, with families combining farming with crafts like watchmaking. Geneva. Geneva in the 18th century was an independent republic, not yet a canton within the Swiss Confederation. It was a predominantly French-speaking city with a strong Calvinist faith. Geneva was prosperous due to its trade and the influx of skilled Protestant refugees from France. Geneva's government was also oligarchic. Only men born in Geneva to citizen families could hold public office. This patrician class held most of the power, with the bourgeoisie and lower classes excluded from government. The consistory of Calvinist clergy exerted significant influence over education, morals, and marriage. Despite its strict religious and political structures, Geneva was experiencing an intellectual awakening. Voltaire noted that many Genevan pastors had embraced a more liberal, reason-based Christianity. Several pastors no longer believed in the divinity of Christ or the concept of eternal hellfire. Religion has been practically reduced to the adoration of a single God among the educated classes in Geneva, the new history. Voltaire believed history should focus on the progress of human civilization rather than just recounting wars and political events. Voltaire also challenged the Eurocentric view of history, giving greater attention to Eastern civilizations like China and India. He engaged in a philosophical battle with the Church, highlighting its role in persecution and argued that it had hindered the Roman Empire. Though Voltaire generally aimed for accuracy, the essay was not without its flaws. Critics pointed out factual errors and accused Voltaire of bias against Christianity. While Voltaire defended his approach, the essay, written over many years, lacked unity and consistency. Despite its shortcomings, the Essai sur les mœurs presented a new vision of history, one that emphasized the development of human civilization, ideas, and customs. Voltaire, feeling increasingly uncomfortable in Switzerland, began longing to return to France. He was able to move back to France in 1758. Chapter 15. The Scholars. In the 18th century, the progress of knowledge was hampered by a number of persistent obstacles. Inertia, superstition, persecution, censorship, and the Church's control over education all played a part in limiting intellectual growth. While these barriers were weaker than in previous centuries, they remained formidable challenges. Traditional beliefs and practices sufficed. Superstition remained widespread, from horoscopes to magical cures and the belief in witchcraft. The persecution of dissent constituted another major obstacle to intellectual freedom. Both Catholic and Protestant institutions sought to suppress ideas that challenged their authority. The 18th century was also marked by a groundbreaking exploration of non-Christian religions and philosophies. The translation and study of texts like the Arabian Nights, the Quran, and the Zend Avesta provided insights into the intellectual and cultural heritage of the East. China, in particular, captivated European intellectuals. From the 16th century onwards, accounts of Chinese civilization by Jesuit missionaries and travelers painted a picture of a sophisticated and well-governed society. The expanding knowledge of the world raised difficult questions for theologians, forcing them to confront the limitations of their doctrines and interpretations. Chapter 16. The Scientific Advance. Science was offering a new revelation, a way of understanding the world that challenged the traditional authority of religion. This was a time when the priesthood of science, focused on educating the intellect, began to challenge the priesthood of religion, focused on molding character. Mathematics, building upon the legacy of Newton. Mathematics, the foundation of all science, saw continued progress, despite initial resistance to the abstract concepts of calculus. B. Bishop Berkeley, in a critique reminiscent of attacks on religious faith, challenged the reliance on authority, taking things on trust, and believing points inconceivable in calculus. The Bernoulli family in Basel produced a lineage of brilliant mathematicians spanning 3 generations. Leonhard Euler, a Swiss mathematician based in St. Petersburg and later Berlin, freed calculus from its geometric origins, establishing it as algebraic calculus, or analysis. Joseph Louis Lagrange, Euler's protégé, reducing complex problems to general formulas that still bear his name. His Mécanique analytique is considered one of the greatest contributions to the economy of thought. Physics, exploring the properties of matter. Physics in the 18th century focused on applying mathematical principles to understand the properties of matter and the laws governing energy, motion, heat, light, magnetism, and electricity. Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis proposed the principle of least action, suggesting that nature always operates with the least possible effort. This principle, later developed by Euler and Lagrange, anticipated the conservation of energy in quantum theory. Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, abandoned as a baby on the steps of a Parisian church, rose to become a mathematician studying fluid dynamics and the motion of vibrating chords. Electricity, a spark of brilliance. The most dramatic advancements in 18th century physics came in the field of electricity. Building upon earlier discoveries of frictional electricity, Stephen Gray distinguished between conductors and insulators. Charles Dufay identified 2 types of electricity, which he termed positive and negative. Luigi Galvani's discovery of the relationship between electricity and muscle contractions in frogs opened up new avenues of research in bioelectricity. Astronomy, measuring the heavens. Refined instruments and mathematical techniques allowed astronomers to make increasingly precise observations and calculations. William Herschel, a German-born musician turned astronomer, discovered Uranus, the first planet to be identified since the Middle Ages. Towards evolution. The 18th century saw the emergence of ideas challenging the traditional view of fixed and unchanging species. Benoît de Maillet, Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis, and Jean-Baptiste Robinet proposed theories suggesting the transformation of species over time, influenced by environmental factors. James Burnet, Lord Monboddo, a Scottish judge, put forth a theory, arguing that humans had evolved from apes, acquiring language and social organization over time. Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, suggested the common ancestry of all warm-blooded animals. Science began to influence technology, with chemical research contributing to advancements in textile manufacturing and the development of new industrial processes. The discrepancies between scientific findings and biblical accounts, particularly regarding the age of the earth and the origin of life, fueled skepticism and debate. Chapter 17. Medicine. While this era may not be considered the most illustrious in medical history, it marked a significant shift towards a more scientific and humane approach to healthcare. Anatomy and physiology. The Hunter brothers, William and John, were prominent figures in British anatomy and surgery. William discovered the lymphatic system's absorbent function and worked on the anatomy of the pregnant uterus. John dissected over 500 animal species and published research on gunshot wounds, tendon injuries, and digestion. Spallanzani, an Italian abbot, investigated digestion, discovering the role of saliva, and demonstrated that gastric juices could break down food even outside the stomach. The ingenuity of disease, a persistent foe. Despite the advancements in medical knowledge, diseases continued to pose a significant threat to human life. Infant mortality rates were up to 50%, particularly in urban slums. In London, 58% of all children died before their 5th birthday. The abandonment of infants was widely practiced. The rise of dry nursing, where babies were bottle-fed instead of being breastfed, further contributed to infant deaths. The death rate of bottle-fed infants was 3 times that of the breastfed. The new method became especially popular in the upper classes of France until Rousseau's Un Meal in 1762 made breastfeeding fashionable. Smallpox remained a dreaded disease, with an estimated 60% of the population contracting it during their lifetime. Voltaire calculated that, in 100 persons that come into the world, at least 60 contract smallpox. Of these 60, 20 die and 20 more keep very disagreeable marks of this cruel disorder as long as they live. Between 1712 and 1715, 3 heirs to the French throne died of smallpox. Epidemics of typhus, typhoid fever, bubonic plague, scarlet fever, malaria, dysentery, and influenza were frequent occurrences. Venereal disease remained prevalent despite the availability of condoms, which were referred to as machines. The vapors, a mixture of nervous exhaustion, insomnia, and boredom, rising at times to hysteria, plagued the upper classes. Offal was emptied into the streets, and hygiene made more progress in armies and navies than in cities. Preventive medicine gained traction, with physicians advocating for the importance of diet and lifestyle in maintaining good health. Medical education saw gradual improvements, but teaching remained limited to a small number of professors. Specialists, narrowing the focus. Otology saw progress in treating ear infections and mastoiditis. The development of sign language by individuals like Giacomo Rodriguez Pereira and Abbé Charles Michel de l'Épée opened new avenues for communication with the deaf and dumb. The treatment of the insane underwent a significant transformation, moving away from the belief that insanity was a form of demonic possession. Quaker-led initiatives in Pennsylvania pioneered humane treatment approaches, recognizing mental illness as a disease requiring care. Philippe Pinel's work in France advocated for removing restraints and providing patients with fresh air, sunlight, and stimulating activities. Surgery, breaking free from the barber. The 18th century witnessed a crucial separation of surgery from its traditional association with barbers, elevating it to a respected branch of medicine. In England, surgeons gained independence from barbers in 1745, with licensing requirements imposed for practicing in London. The Royal College of Surgeons was officially chartered in 1800, solidifying the profession's standing. Dentistry evolved from tooth-pulling practices to a recognized surgical field. Anesthesia, however, remained largely absent from surgical procedures. While soporifics and alcohol were sometimes used, effective anesthetic agents like nitrous oxide and ether were not discovered until the very end of the century. The foundation for evidence-based medicine was being laid. Chapter 18, The Atheists, a new breed of philosophers. The Philosophes of this era were a different breed from their predecessors. They were not confined to academic institutions, but were engaged with society, writing in clear and accessible language that resonated with the educated public. They moved away from complex metaphysical systems and instead focused on practical issues, often using satire and wit to critique the status quo. This new approach made philosophy a social force, reaching beyond the confines of academia and influencing public discourse. The philosophic ecstasy. The Philosophes believed that the spread of knowledge and rational thinking could lead to progress in all areas of life, from education and government to morality and religion. This optimism, however, was tempered by the recognition that reason was fallible and often subservient to desire. They also acknowledged that the majority of people were too burdened by their daily struggles to engage in deep philosophical thought. France's rebellion against Christianity stemmed from a deep-seated resentment against the Church's perceived abuses of power and its stranglehold on intellectual freedom. A priest's damning testament. Jean Maillet. Jean Maillet was a parish priest who secretly harbored deep-seated atheism. Maillet's testament, discovered after his death, is described as the most comprehensive critique of Christianity of its time. Apparently, he had lost his religious faith before ordination. If I embraced a profession so directly opposed to my sentiments, it was not through cupidity. I obeyed my parents. Maillet's doubts stemmed from his study of the Bible, which he found riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. After all, was there ever a stranger and more incredible God than this? For thousands of years he kept himself hidden from mankind, and heard without any clear and visible response the prayers and praises of billions of men. He is supposed to be infinitely wise, but his empire is ridden with disorder and destruction. He is supposed to be good, but he punishes like an inhuman fiend. He is supposed to be just, and he lets the wicked prosper and his saints be tortured to death. He is continually occupied in creating and destroying. Maillet's critique went beyond theological arguments. He saw religion as a tool of oppression, used by the church and state to control the masses. He argued that morality did not require divine intervention and could be based on reason and self-interest. He called for freedom of thought and a secular education system that would liberate humanity from the shackles of superstition. Is man a machine? La Mettrie's bold proposition. Julien Offroy de La Mettrie, a physician and philosopher, further pushed the boundaries of materialist thought. He argued that man is nothing more than a complex machine, governed by physical and chemical laws. La Mettrie's argument stemmed from his observations of the human body, particularly during his time as an army surgeon. He saw clear evidence that bodily processes influence thought and behavior. He extended this logic to animals, arguing against Descartes' view that animals lacked souls. La Mettrie's materialistic view led him to reject the concept of a soul and to posit that the mind was merely a product of the brain's physical organization. There is no great difference between the simplest man and the most intelligent animal. Imbeciles are animals with human faces, as the intelligent ape is a little man in another shape. Voltaire describes La Mettrie. There is here too gay a man, it is La Mettrie. His ideas are fireworks, always in the form of skyrockets. His chatter is amusing for half a quarter of an hour, and mortally tiresome thereafter. He has just made, without knowing it, a bad book in which he proscribes virtue and remorse, eulogizes the vices, and invites his readers to disorderly living, all without bad intention. There are in his work 1,000 brilliant touches, and not half a page of reason. God keep me from taking him for my doctor. He would give me corrosive sublimate instead of rhubarb, very innocently, and then begin to laugh. This strange doctor is the king's reader, and the best of it is that he is at present reading to him the history of the church. He goes over hundreds of pages of it, and there are places where monarch and reader are ready to choke with laughter. Chapter 19. Diderot and the Encyclopedie. Born in 1713, Denis Diderot's early years were marked by a restless spirit and a thirst for knowledge that would later fuel his work on the Encyclopedie. Shiftless years, a young man's rebellion. After a brief flirtation with the priesthood, he abandoned his cassock and plunged headlong into the world of Enlightenment Paris. These years, marked by financial instability and a series of fleeting jobs, allowed Diderot to cultivate his intellectual appetite of mathematics, languages, and philosophy. His personal life mirrored this turbulence. Diderot's passionate nature led him to a romance with Antoinette Champion, culminating in a clandestine marriage that initially infuriated his father. Their relationship was strained by Diderot's infidelities and financial struggles. Through it all, Diderot's intellectual pursuits continued. He even ventured into the realm of erotic literature, penning the scandalous novel Les Bijoux Indiscrets. While seemingly frivolous, the novel showcased Diderot's ability to weave philosophical insights into unexpected genres, a blind man's world. Diderot's observations led him to argue that moral concepts are not divinely ordained but are shaped by sensory experience. He even suggested that a blind person might not be able to conceive of God, as the traditional argument from design would be inaccessible to them. This radical essay, laced with materialist undertones and veiled criticisms of religious dogma, landed Diderot in trouble with the authorities. He was imprisoned at Vincennes, a monumental undertaking, history of a book. The Encyclopédie stands as the crowning achievement of Diderot's intellectual life, an undertaking that actively shaped the course of the Enlightenment. He showed resilience in the face of censorship and opposition, and rallied a diverse group of thinkers around a common goal, from translation to transformation. The Encyclopédie's origins were humble. It began as a proposed translation of Ephraim Chambers' Cyclopedia, a popular English reference work. As Diderot became involved, the project's scope expanded dramatically. Dissatisfied with the limitations of Chambers' work, he envisioned a completely new encyclopedia, one that would encompass the full breadth of human knowledge and reflect the spirit of the French Enlightenment. Securing funding for such an ambitious project was a challenge, but he was successful in attracting subscribers from the middle class. A triumph of persistence. The final volume of text was published in 1765, marking the culmination of over 2 decades of dedicated work. The completed Encyclopédie became a landmark achievement of the Enlightenment, disseminating knowledge across Europe and laying the groundwork for the intellectual and social transformations to come. Inside the Encyclopédie, a window into the Enlightenment mind. The Encyclopédie's contents provide a glimpse into the intellectual landscape of 18th century France. Beyond its stated aim of compiling knowledge, the work served as a platform for the Philosophes' critique of traditional beliefs and institutions, a subtle assault on faith. While the Encyclopédie contained articles on religious doctrine and ritual, often written by priests, its overall tone was one of skepticism and veiled criticism of the Catholic Church. Diderot and his collaborators employed a range of tactics to undermine traditional beliefs. They exposed contradictions in the Bible and highlighted the achievements of non-Christian civilizations. Vision of a better world. The Encyclopédie went beyond mere compilation of knowledge. It offered a vision for a more just and equitable society. Articles on political and social issues advocated for freedom of speech in the press, criticized the abuses of power by the church and state, and called for reforms to address social ills like poverty and inequality. The work championed the rising middle class and promoted economic theories like physiocracy, which emphasized free trade and limited government intervention, celebrating technology and craftsmanship. Recognizing the transformative power of technology, the Encyclopédie devoted considerable attention to the mechanical arts, the legacy of a landmark achievement. Despite its flaws, factual errors, inconsistencies, and a clear anti-religious bias, the Encyclopédie paved the way for the revolutionary upheavals that would soon transform Europe. Chapter 20, Diderot Proteus. Diderot is a fascinating figure, much like the sea god Proteus, constantly changing and assuming new forms. He was a man of diverse interests, contributing to science, literature, philosophy, and art. While he never bothered with consistency, his composite direction was clear. He was driven by ideas, throwing them onto paper to see what they might become. The pantheist. Diderot pondered the evolution of species and the possibility of their eventual disappearance. He saw nature as his god, a living, neutral matter, indifferent to good and evil, concerned with the species rather than the individual. Diderot on Christianity. Diderot's philosophical stance largely dispensed with the need for a deity. While publicly a deist, he was often antagonistic towards Christianity, considering it absurd and harmful. He was particularly critical of the Church's influence on morality, arguing that it fostered larger conflicts while discouraging minor crimes. Despite his criticisms, he acknowledged the aesthetic and emotional power of Catholic rituals. Diderot believed that belief in God would eventually disappear, but later admitted it might persist. Ethics and politics. Diderot's ethical and political views were complex and sometimes contradictory. He recognized the inherent duality of human nature, caught between natural instincts and the demands of social order. He initially advocated for a return to nature, seeing instinct as a path to freedom. However, as he matured, he adopted a more pessimistic view of human nature, acknowledging the need for social restraints and laws. His political leanings favored democratic ideals, but he was pragmatic in his approach to reform. He believed in the power of education to elevate society and advocated for a national assembly chosen by property owners. Diderot was critical of absolute monarchy, yet he saw the importance of protecting property rights and liberating industry from excessive government control. Diderot, the man. Diderot was a blend of contradictions, a lover of comfort and luxury who championed poverty, a harsh critic of society who cherished his friendships, a skeptic who was moved by religious feeling. He found intellectual companionship and love with his mistress, Sophie Valland, to whom he poured out his thoughts and feelings in remarkable letters. Diderot's social life revolved around conversation and debate. He was a captivating orator, renowned for his passionate monologues and the sheer brilliance of his ideas. His friends marveled at his intellectual prowess and the infectious energy he brought to discussions. Will Durant writes, "While his legacy during his lifetime was largely confined to those who knew him personally, his influence on later generations of writers, artists, and thinkers solidified his place as a key figure of the Enlightenment. He was, in the words of Michelet, a true Prometheus." Chapter 21, The Spreading Campaign. The campaign against Christianity was intensifying, and two major figures, Helvetius and D'Holbach, emerged as powerful voices for atheism and radical social reform. While Diderot, as we have seen, wrestled with inconsistencies and explored diverse philosophical paths, these two men presented a more systematic and resolute attack on established beliefs and institutions. Helvetius, from millionaire to revolutionary. Helvetius, born into a wealthy family, seemed destined for a life of comfort and privilege. However, inspired by Voltaire and other Philosophes, he abandoned his career in finance to pursue a life of intellectual inquiry and social reform. This unexpected transformation is reminiscent of Diderot's own rejection of a conventional path, though Helvetius's turn was even more dramatic, given his privileged background. Development. After retiring to his estate and immersing himself in philosophical circles, Helvetius devoted 7 years to crafting his magnum opus, De l'Esprit, on intelligence. Published in 1758, the book ignited controversy and quickly became a bestseller, much like Diderot's Encyclopedie, though Helvetius's work faced even more aggressive censorship and condemnation. Philosophy. Helvetius's philosophy drew heavily on Locke and Hobbes, emphasizing the role of sensation and experience in shaping human understanding and behavior. He argued that all ideas originate from sensory experience, and that differences in individual character and abilities stem from variations in environment and education rather than innate qualities. His most controversial proposition was the assertion that all men are born with equal mental capacity. This challenged the prevailing notion of inherent social hierarchies and implied that inequality was a product of unjust social systems rather than natural differences. Like Diderot, Helvetius believed in the power of education to transform society, but he went further, calling for state-controlled education accessible to all, regardless of sex or social standing. D'Holbach, the Baron of Atheism. Paul Heinrich Dietrich von Holbach, known as Baron d'Holbach, was a German-born philosopher and scientist who became a central figure in the Parisian Enlightenment. His wealth and generosity made him a beloved patron of the Philosophes, and his home became a hub for intellectual discourse and debate. The amiable atheist. D'Holbach's weekly dinners and salon gatherings, much like the salon culture that nurtured Diderot's intellectual development, provided a space for free and open discussion on philosophy, religion, and politics. D'Holbach's affable personality and genuine kindness contrasted with his radical atheism, making him both admired and feared. He was described by contemporaries as a man of impeccable character, devoted to his friends and family, and deeply committed to the pursuit of truth and the well-being of humanity. The system of nature. He rejected the notion of a supernatural creator or a disembodied soul, arguing that mind is a function of the brain and ceases to exist after death. His deterministic view of human behavior, asserting that our actions are determined by prior causes and not free will, challenged traditional notions of moral responsibility and sparked debate among philosophers and theologians. Morals in the state. Despite his atheism, D'Holbach believed in the possibility of a moral society without religious belief. He argued that morality should be based on human needs and the principles of social harmony, rather than on divine commands or the fear of punishment in the afterlife. In his political writings, D'Holbach advocated for the abolition of hereditary aristocracy and the separation of church and state. D'Holbach and his critics. Even Voltaire, despite his own criticisms of Christianity, felt compelled to distance himself from D'Holbach's atheism. He argued that belief in God was necessary for social stability and provided consolation in the face of life's hardships. This tension between radical atheism and more moderate forms of deism reflects the diversity of thought within the Enlightenment and the challenges of reconciling reason with the human need for meaning and purpose. Despite these criticisms, D'Holbach's materialist philosophy resonated with a generation disillusioned with traditional authority. Chapter 22: Voltaire and Christianity. While he was undoubtedly a fierce critic of the Church and its doctrines, his personal beliefs were more nuanced, evolving from a youthful skepticism to a mature theism and, in his later years, to a somewhat surprising acceptance of the social utility of religion. Voltaire and God. Voltaire, he never fully embraced materialism or atheism, finding solace in the concept of a designing intelligence behind the intricate workings of the universe. Argument from design. Like Paley, who would later popularize the watchmaker analogy, Voltaire saw evidence of God's hand in the apparent order and purposefulness of nature. He argued that the complexity of the eye, for instance, pointed to an intelligent creator, just as the intricate mechanism of a watch implied the existence of a watchmaker. Theism versus deism. While often labeled a deist, Voltaire's God was not merely an impersonal force but a conscious being who designed and ruled the world. He affirmed this theistic belief in his philosophical dictionary, describing God as equally good and powerful, a just judge who rewards virtue and punishes vice. Voltaire and the Encyclopedie. Voltaire was an ardent supporter of the Encyclopedie, recognizing its potential to spread knowledge and challenge traditional authority. He contributed numerous articles ranging from Fire and Genius to essays on history and philosophy. His involvement, however, was not without friction. He criticized the editors for including poorly written or inaccurate entries and urged them to maintain a high standard of clarity and conciseness. When government and church pressure intensified, Voltaire's courage faltered, and he temporarily withdrew his support, fearing persecution. The theology of earthquakes. The devastating Lisbon earthquake of 1755 shook Voltaire's faith in a benevolent God, prompting him to question Leibnizian optimism and the notion that all is well in the best of all possible worlds. His poem, On the Lisbon Disaster, captures this crisis of faith, lamenting the senseless suffering. But what crime, what fault had those infants committed who lay crushed and bloody on their mothers' breasts? Had London or Paris less vice than Lisbon? Yet Lisbon is shattered, and Paris dances. Could not an omniscient God have made a world without such meaningless suffering? I respect my God, but I love mankind. The conscience of Europe. Voltaire's engagement with social justice went beyond philosophical critiques. He became a tireless advocate for the wrongly accused, taking up the cases of Jean Collas, Pierre-Paul Servin, and the Chevalier de la Barre. These cases, involving accusations of murder motivated by religious prejudice, revealed the dark underbelly of religious fanaticism and the corrupt legal system that often served as its instrument. The Collas Affair. The wrongful execution of Jean Collas, a Protestant accused of murdering his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism, spurred Voltaire's lifelong crusade for religious tolerance and judicial reform. He campaigned for Collas's posthumous exoneration, mobilizing public opinion and utilizing his vast network of contacts to pressure the authorities. Servin and La Barre. Voltaire also championed the cause of Pierre-Paul Servin, falsely accused of killing his daughter to prevent her conversion, and the Chevalier de la Barre, a young man brutally executed for alleged blasphemy. These cases, marked by religious bigotry and legal injustice, solidified Voltaire's role as the conscience of Europe, a fearless defender of the oppressed and a voice against the abuses of power. Écrises l'infâme. Voltaire's outrage at the Collas Affair and the resurgence of religious persecution in France intensified his opposition to Christianity, leading to his most aggressive attacks on the Church. His battle cry, XVIII fame became a rallying cry for the Philosophes and a symbol of the Enlightenment struggle against superstition and intolerance. Target of his ire, while often interpreted as a call for the destruction of religion in general, Voltaire's infamy referred specifically to the organized religion that fostered fanaticism, controlled education, and stifled dissent through censorship and persecution. He primarily targeted the Catholic Church, though he also condemned the intolerance of Calvinism and other forms of Protestant extremism. The Dictionnaire philosophique, Voltaire's Dictionnaire philosophique, served as his primary weapon in this war of ideas, presenting a collection of short, pointed essays that challenged biblical authority. Why had not Christ kept his promise to come in a cloud, with power and great glory, to establish the kingdom of God, before this generation shall pass away? What had detained him? Was the fog too thick? What must I do with those who dare to doubt? Must I, for their edification, have the ordinary and extraordinary question or torture put to them? Or, would it not be better to avoid these labyrinths and simply preach virtue, religion, and reason? Voltaire recognized the human need for religion but believed that it should be grounded in reason and morality rather than superstition and dogma. He advocated for a natural religion based on the worship of a supreme being, ethical conduct, and universal tolerance. Religion's social utility. While initially advocating for a morality independent of religious belief, Voltaire eventually conceded that some form of religion was necessary for social stability. He argued that the masses needed the fear of divine punishment to deter them from crime, ultimately endorsing the concept of hell as a useful deterrent. Voltaire bigot. In his later years, Voltaire's views on religion softened, leading some to accuse him of hypocrisy or backsliding into bigotry. This shift reflected a combination of factors: his pragmatic recognition of religion's social utility, a desire to secure a peaceful death within the Catholic Church, and perhaps a genuine yearning for spiritual solace in the face of aging and mortality. Reconciliation with the Church. Voltaire's public embrace of Catholicism, including attending Mass, taking communion, and building a church on his estate, surprised and disillusioned many of his fellow Philosophes. His motives remain a subject of debate. Chapter 23, The Triumph of the Philosophes. From scholarly rebuttals to biting satire, the clash of ideas reverberated across France. The clergy fights back. The Church, initially caught off guard by the ferocity of the Enlightenment critique, mounted a vigorous counteroffensive. This was not merely a rearguard action by a dying institution. Between 1715 and 1789, over 900 works were published in defense of Christianity in France alone. These ranged from sophisticated theological treatises to popular apologetics, all aimed at stemming the tide of unbelief. Appeals to reason and evidence. Thinkers like the Abbé Houtville argued that the miracles attesting to the divinity of Christianity were as historically reliable as any secular event. Others sought to reconcile faith and science, pointing to the wonders of nature as evidence of a divine designer. Moral necessity of religion. A common theme among Christian apologists was the indispensable role of religion in upholding morality. They argued that purely secular restraints were inadequate, warning that without the fear of God, society would descend into chaos. The anti-philosophies. While theologians engaged in intellectual combat, another group, dubbed the anti-philosophes, emerged to ridicule and discredit the leading figures of the Enlightenment. These were primarily journalists who used sharp humor and insults as their weapons of choice, aiming to discredit the Philosophes in the eyes of the public. Never has hell vomited up a more deadly plague. Voluptuousness here impudently displays the most lewd pictures. Obscenity borrows the language of the marketplace. The basest buffoonery seasons its impiety. The odor given off by these verses is enough to infect and corrupt every age and condition in society. Frérin's Année littéraire. Élie Catherine Frérin, a skilled polemicist, launched the Année littéraire in 1754, using it as a platform to attack the Philosophes' ideas and lampoon their personal lives. Never was there an age more fertile than ours in seditious writers who concentrate all their powers on attacking the Godhead. They call themselves apostles of humanity, never realizing that it ill befits a citizen and does a grave disservice to mankind. to rob them of the only hopes which offer them some mitigation of their life's ills. They do not understand that they are upsetting the social order, inciting the poor against the rich, the weak against the strong, and putting arms into millions of hands hitherto restrained from violence by moral and religious sense, quite as much as by the law. Palissot's theatrical satire. Charles Palissot de Montigny, initially a disciple of Voltaire, turned against the Philosophes after a personal falling out with Diderot. His play, Les Philosophes, humorized leading Enlightenment figures, particularly Helvetius and Rousseau, as pedantic fools and dangerous radicals. By dint of enlightening ourselves, we have found more void than fullness. This void, persisting in our souls and our imagination, is the true cause of our melancholy. After all is said and done, incredulity is the greatest effort the spirit of man may make against his own instincts and tastes. Men need certainty. The majority of men, and especially of women, whose imagination is double ours, could not be agnostic. Moreau and the Cuckoax, Jacob Nicolas Moreau's satire, Nouveau Mémoire pour servir à l'histoire des Cuckoax, 1757, employed a particularly memorable insult, labeling the Philosophes as Cuckoax, poisonous creatures who polluted the air with their venomous words. This term became popular in everyday discourse. The fall of the Jesuits. The Jesuits, once the most powerful religious order in Europe, found themselves caught in the crossfire between the rising tide of Enlightenment thought and the growing assertiveness of the French monarchy and the Parlement. Resentment and accusations. The Jesuits faced multiple enemies, a resentful Madame de Pompadour, whom they had refused to absolve for her relationship with the king, a monarchy suspicious of their allegiance to the Pope, and the Jansenist-dominated Parlement, eager to avenge past persecution. Accusations against the order ranged from heresy and idolatry to financial corruption and political intrigue. La Valette's bankruptcy. The financial troubles of Father Antoine de la Valette, a Jesuit entrepreneur in the West Indies, provided the Parlement with an opportunity to strike. When the society refused to honor La Valette's debts, the Parlement launched an investigation into the order's constitution and activities. Dissolution and expulsion. After a series of legal maneuvers and pronouncements, the Parlement ordered the dissolution of the Jesuit order in France and the confiscation of their property. Louis XV, pressured by both the Philosophes and the Parlement, ultimately signed the decree of expulsion in 1764, Education in Progress. With the Jesuits gone, the question of who would educate French youth became a central concern. This opened the door for a revolution, with both secular and religious forces vying for control of the educational system. La Charlottaise's Essai d'éducation nationale. Louis-René de la Charlottaise, a prominent lawyer and critic of the Jesuits, advocated for a national system of education controlled by the state. He called for a curriculum focused on modern languages, science, history, and practical skills, arguing that education should prepare citizens for life rather than for the afterlife. Debates over universal education. While many Philosophes supported state-controlled education, there was disagreement over whether it should extend to all classes. Voltaire, echoing La Charlottaise, believed that education for the masses was unnecessary and potentially disruptive to the social order. He preferred a system that would educate the elite, who would then guide the monarch towards enlightened policies. Diderot's Plan d'une université. Diderot, in his Plan d'une université pour le gouvernement de la Russie, presented a more expansive vision of education. He emphasized the importance of science, practical skills, and accessibility to all classes, regardless of social background. The new morality. The decline of religious belief raised a crucial question: could a society survive without the moral framework provided by religion? The Philosophes grappled with this challenge, attempting to formulate a secular ethic capable of sustaining social order, natural ethics, and self-love. Many Philosophes believed that morality could be grounded in reason and self-interest. They argued that individuals, properly educated, would recognize that their own happiness was ultimately dependent on the well-being of society as a whole. Happiness and the common good. The pursuit of happiness was seen as the natural and legitimate goal of human life. However, the Philosophes emphasized that true happiness was not simply the gratification of individual desires, but rather the harmonious fulfillment of both personal and social needs. From bienfaisance to l'humanité, the Philosophes promoted a new set of ethical values centered on active mutual aid and humanitarianism. This shift from divine worship to human service reflected the Enlightenment's focus on earthly well-being and its faith in the potential for human progress. Religion in retreat. By the 1770s, Christianity seemed to be losing ground across France. While the masses remained largely devout, skepticism had become fashionable among the educated elite and even segments of the clergy itself. Spread of unbelief. Reports from across France testified to the decline of religious belief, particularly among the upper classes. Salons, once centers of religious piety, transformed into hubs of skepticism, with members openly expressing their disdain for faith. Even within the church, atheism and deism found adherents, particularly among younger and more intellectually inclined clergymen. The rise of toleration. The weakening of religious belief contributed to a growing climate of toleration. Laws against Protestants were gradually relaxed, and the persecution of heretics became less frequent. While the Philosophes championed toleration, it's important to note that they were not always consistent in their own practices, sometimes resorting to censorship and legal pressure against their critics. Voltaire on several occasions begged the authorities to suppress parodies and libels against the philosophic group. By the time Voltaire returned to Paris in 1778, the Philosophes had achieved a remarkable triumph. Their ideas dominated intellectual discourse, shaping the minds of a generation and influencing the policies of monarchs across Europe. Voltaire's legacy. Voltaire emerged as the undisputed leader of the Enlightenment. His writings, translated and disseminated across Europe and America, inspired a generation of reformers and revolutionaries. Contributing to the expansion of education, the reform of legal systems, and the growth of religious tolerance. The Philosophes' belief in the power of reason to solve humanity's problems proved to be overly optimistic. They underestimated the enduring power of irrationality and the complex interplay of social forces that shape history.